Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
So hello and welcome to this episode of The Print Page Turner, in which we are going to look at a book which is a deep dive into mental asylum and into the history of insanity and asylums in India. And most importantly, gives an insight into how legislations as well as institutional care of mental health has been shaped in India. And to tell us more, we have with us Daman Singh, who's the author of Asylum. Welcome, Daman.
Thank you so much, Tina.
So, would you begin by giving us insights on how you feel terms like mental health, lunacy, and asylum are now perceived in India? Has the language shifted a bit?
The language has shifted a lot. There was a time when it was quite standard to use the word lunatic or insane. Terms like this have now gone out of our vocabulary. It is considered derogatory to use such terms. And even the word asylum has acquired very negative connotations. And I've used it in my book purely in a historical sense. But I would not use this term for any mental hospital today.
How was insanity and mental health, written within Indian literature? And so why this book now? Like why this book and why this book now? Actually.
Well, to the first part of your question, to tell you the truth, I don't know. I haven't really explored literature in Hindi or in vernacular languages. But I do see that a lot has been written in the English language, which is a language that I am most familiar with. I happen to read quite a bit about the subject, and I happen to be exposed to a lot of debates and discussions on the subject, and that is what drew me to look into it more carefully. And one of the things I realized was that the background of mental health care institutions, the way it was written, or the time that it was written in, was almost overwhelmingly negative. And very few authors, very few scholars have actually looked at the period when reforms actually began in this country. And it was really my objective and my focus to look at that process. How did mental health care become a concern for public authorities in India?
Okay, so there's this story called Toba Takes Singh by Manto, which is pretty famous, and it's an example that comes to my mind since it's set against a backdrop of partition. And you've also have a chapter in the book which talks about the time when partition happened and how the institutions were then affected. So would you tell us more about that?
Well, Manto's story, short story, Toba Tate Singh, is a very famous story and I think very well known, at least in India, if not elsewhere. It is set in a mental hospital in Pakistan, what is now Pakistan. It's at the time of partition, so one doesn't really know for sure. But it talks about the perspective of mental patients at that time, when the country was being divided, when its assets were being divided, when its property was being divided, when its people were being divided. And there is this discussion in the story that where do we belong? Is anybody asking us where we came from and where we want to go? And at the time, I think it was very widely viewed as a sort of rhetorical question, or perhaps it was not realized that this question actually had strong historical roots, because in mental hospitals at the time, for instance, in Lahore, which went to Pakistan, there were patients who technically belonged to India, and there were other patients who technically belonged to Pakistan. Now, how are these patients to be dealt with? Similarly, you had, a number of mental hospitals in India whose families may have migrated to what is now, what was then either East Pakistan or West Pakistan. So this question that is raised in this short story is actually a very real question for us to look at in that uh, period of time as well as today.
So you have used this term in the book, which is military insanes. And do you think mental health is now more important in the military, and many of these military insanes were Britishers, right, in India. So do you think there were differences in the way they were being treated as opposed to, let's say, people from India who were, patients, they were being treated?
Well, firstly, I haven't coined the term military insane. This was the official nomenclature. It was the official term used for people who were part of the armed forces and who developed or happened to have some sort of mental illness. To tell you the truth, I haven't studied this aspect in detail. I would not know how mental health has been handled in the armed forces over the years. But to go back to your question, if I remember it right, the military insanes in the colonial period were not all British. There were a lot of Indian military insanes. After all, you had the British Indian Army. And especially during World War I and World War II, a very large number of Indian soldiers were serving in the British Indian Army. So you did have both British and Indian, what was then called military insanes. I should perhaps add one little point that I believe from what I have read, that the military has, at least in the past several decades, moved forward very rapidly on dealing with the subject of mental health within its ranks. But I'm not the right person to talk about.
So I'm somebody who, for like our organization, I do videos on mental health. So I have a show which comes every week, which is why also this was a very, very fascinating read for me. And I don't think there has been a book, at least in India, where this documentation has been done, like this exhaustive documentation of how asylums, which were set up, how they were run, and how terms like these terms, like you just said, terms like military insanes, that even if you don't, which is why it was still a very interesting term, because I had not come across this term. Or when you are talking about alienists in the book, and how everybody had this method of what they thought was best for patients, right? Like it has been a whole history where everybody's thought that they are doing the best for patients probably, and whether or not they worked out, I think, is actually, it's basically, I think, a transitional thing constantly, right? Where you're basically experimenting. Everybody's experimenting. Nobody knows for sure, like, this is going to work. And you've also talked about that in terms of treatments, that, which treatments work. And it was very, very fascinating to specifically know about where the treatment where the patients would be made to sit in a tub and hot water would, because even in my show, I think at once, like, on more than one occasions, I've said that, a good bath can be really, really therapeutic. So it was very, very interesting to note that these were methods that have such a history, from then to now, and also in India. So the next question that I have is, could you tell us more, or could you tell my audience more about the Indian Lunacy Act that you sort of mentioned? And so one of the things, again, that you have mentioned is voluntary boarding that came up. So did voluntary boarding meant more people were coming out and, getting admitted, or admitting that they have a mental health condition? Or did it cause further alienation and discrimination because now it was, let's say, sort of out in the open?
What a long question you have asked. It's hard to keep track of it. About the Indian Lunacy Act. Well, this act, I think, dates back to 1912, but it was very almost identical to an earlier act, which was in maybe 1858. I'm not sure if I've got the year right. It it was a very short, a very brief act, and it basically said how an individual could be admitted to an asylum and what the process was for discharge. So, because admission was a legal act. It wasn't like you go to your doctor, when you're sick and say, I have this problem, please treat me. In those days, it all had to go through a magistrate or a police commissioner, wherever there were police commissioners. So there was nothing very much more than that in that act. But it did have a very interesting provision, which was called the Voluntary Border, which was that if a person felt that he or she needed treatment, he could or she could go to a mental hospital and say, please admit me for treatment. And that person could also leave the hospital with a day's notice if he or she felt satisfied that he was feeling fine, or even if he was not satisfied with the treatment. Now, this concept had been introduced in other parts of the world. And I think it also was there in private mental hospitals in England, but perhaps not in public mental hospitals in England. So the introduction of this concept was really very revolutionary. Now, the sad part is that the hospitals were not really equipped to accept such patients. There were, firstly, very few hospitals in number. They had very few beds, if they had beds at all. And they were constantly overcrowded, at least in those days. So while this opportunity existed in the law books, it was very rarely exercised. I think, to my mind, there are only two mental hospitals, which actually managed to admit voluntary patients, and that was the hospital at Ranchi, which was then only for Europeans and Anglo-Indians, and also the hospital at Madras. But apart from these two hospitals, at that time there were 20 odd hospitals, very few of them actually saw any voluntary patients.
In the book, I think when you're talking about the Madras hospital, I mean, what appeared to me is that is also one of the most forward-thinking hospitals in terms of the way they were looking and looking after the treatment of patients, or generally looking after the patients right from the beginning of when it started. Right? Is that so?
I have no idea. I think every hospital is as progressive as the people who run it. If you have a progressive medical superintendent, you will have a progressive hospital. If you have a progressive state government, you will have progressive hospitals in that state. So I think it's all really a question of leadership.
Okay. So why do you think that in the disability sector, mental health has been the last to sort of come out of stigma?
I think it is probably because of centuries of mystery surrounding mental illness, the inability to understand why do some people behave differently? Why do they think differently? Why do they feel differently? And this incomprehension it arouses both sort of fear and skepticism. One says, one would say, well, if I can behave perfectly, so-called normally in this situation, why can't you? So it is not an easy illness to understand, either for the person who has it or for the people who surround that person.
Thank you so much for talking to me today. This was really, really insightful. And like I said, I have read the book and it has been a really, really, for somebody who, I think what you mentioned earlier about how within, India and even in English, like there has been very little written about this topic. Like the only other book that I remember in detail, and that is not obviously from India, is Foucault's idea of where he's talking about the history of madness. And he's talking about institutions. And I think your book sort of takes us there, except we are obviously in India, and how probably even and Tejpur being one of the places that the asylums has. And I remember how the way we would use the word asylum there, because
May I say something before we end?
Sure, of course.
I really wish to emphasize that I'm not an intellectual, and this is not an intellectual book. It is not a scholarly book. It is not an academic book. It is a book, I would say, in the words of an ordinary citizen. It is written for ordinary citizens, people like me, who want to know more, who want to understand more. So it is written in a extremely simple, uncomplicated style that anybody who has even the slightest interest in the subject would probably find worth reading.
Again, thank you for coming and talking to us on the print page turn. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.